Madeline Brooks stood with her arms crossed, her cold blue eyes locked onto Clara with undisguised disdain. The coffee she had just thrown still dripped from the polished glass table, the dark liquid spreading in slow, lazy streams across the pristine surface. The entire office was frozen in silence, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "I said clean it again," she repeated, her voice sharp and commanding, as if daring Clara to defy her. Clara exhaled slowly, gripping the rag in her hand. She had spent the past week being ordered around, ridiculed, and treated like dirt. But this was something else. This wasn't just disrespect. It was humiliation, served up in the most public way possible. Employees walking past stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting between Madeline and Clara, some amused, others wary. No one spoke up. No one ever did. That was how things worked in Johnson Technologies. The powerful stayed in control, and the powerless knew their place. Clara felt the weight of every moment leading up to this. She thought of how Eric Simmons, the senior manager, had smirked at her since day one, how he had called her boy under his breath when he thought she wasn't listening, how Kevin, another janitor, had warned her to keep her head down if she wanted to last in this place. She glanced at the coffee-stained table, then back at Madeline, whose lips were curled into a smug smile. The woman was enjoying this. Clara's fingers tightened around the rag. This was the moment. Not yet, she reminded herself. She took a steady breath and bent down, wiping the table again, feeling the heat of dozens of eyes burning into her back. "That's more like it," Madeline sneered. "Maybe if you did it right the first time, we wouldn't have to waste all this coffee." A few nearby employees chuckled under their breath. Clara forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't react. Not yet. But she memorized every face, every smirk, every cruel glance. Suddenly, a slow, deliberate clapping sound echoed through the office. Eric Simmons. "Now that's the kind of dedication we love to see," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A real team player." Clara straightened, locking eyes with him. His smug grin widened, but for a split second, she saw something else flicker in his gaze. Uncertainty. That's right, Clara thought. You don't know what's coming. Madeline turned her back on Clara, waving a dismissive hand. "Get back to work. Try not to screw up the next time." Clara didn't move. Not right away. She stood there for a moment longer, her heartbeat steady, her expression neutral. Then, with slow precision, she picked up the rag, wrung out the excess liquid, and placed it neatly on her janitorial cart. She turned on her heel and walked away, feeling the weight of every step, the eyes still lingering on her back. As she rounded the corner, Natalie Parker, a junior marketing assistant, caught up with her. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her eyes filled with concern. Clara gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Natalie hesitated. That was completely out of line. Madeline does this to everyone she thinks she can push around. But this was disgusting. Clara met Natalie's gaze. She saw something different in her. Something rare in this building. A conscience. "Don't worry," Clara said, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "She'll regret it soon enough." Natalie blinked as if unsure what to make of the response. Before she could say anything else, a sudden ripple of excitement swept through the office. People whispered, heads turned, employees hurried to fix their ties, smooth their dresses, and check their reflections in the glass walls. Something big was happening. The receptionist's phone rang sharply. She answered it. In the moment she did, her face went pale. She swallowed hard, then shot to her feet, her voice suddenly professional, bordering on nervous. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." She hung up and turned toward the main office floor. "Mr. Samuel Johnson is on his way up," she announced, her voice slightly trembling. The words sent shockwaves through the building. Clara's chest tightened. It was time. The CEO, the founder, the man whose last name was on the company's building, was coming. And no one, not Madeline, not Eric, not anyone, had any idea why. The office erupted into a frenzy. Employees scrambled to their desks. Senior managers whispered amongst themselves, trying to guess what was happening. Eric ran a hand through his slicked back hair, adjusting his suit. He turned to Madeline, who was still oblivious to the storm about to hit. "This is it," Eric murmured, a confident smirk on his face. "If I play my cards right, maybe I'll finally get that promotion." Madeline grinned, still basking in her earlier power play. Maybe we both will. The elevator doors dinged. Silence fell over the room. Clara inhaled deeply and stepped forward. Samuel Johnson emerged, flanked by senior executives, his presence commanding, his face unreadable. Every employee straightened. Eric took a step forward, his smirk widening. Mr. Johnson, it's an honor. Samuel's eyes didn't even flicker toward him. Instead, they locked directly onto Clara. Clara, he said, his deep voice carrying across the room. Come here. The entire office froze. Eric's smirk vanished. Madeline's eyes widened in confusion. And as Clara stepped forward, her janitor's uniform still stained with coffee, a slow, powerful smile spread across her face. The office floor was a flurry of hushed whispers and frantic movements. Employees straightened their suits, double-checked their reflections in the glass walls, and scurried to their desk as if the arrival of Samuel Johnson himself demanded perfection. But amidst all the chaos, Eric Simmons stood still, his chest puffed out, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He adjusted his tie and threw a smirk at Madeline Brooks, who was fixing her blouse, trying to compose herself after her latest act of cruelty. This is it, Eric muttered under his breath. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Madeline nodded, still oblivious to the storm about to hit. She glanced once at Clara Johnson, still standing there in her janitor's uniform, the coffee stain drying on her sleeve. A look of superiority crossed Madeline's face. She had no idea that the woman she had just humiliated was the one person she should fear the most. Then the elevator chimed. Silence. All eyes turned toward the gleaming metal doors as they slid open, revealing Samuel Johnson himself. He stepped forward with authority, his tailored gray suit immaculate, his face unreadable. Behind him, a team of senior executives followed, their presence commanding, their expressions carefully composed. But it wasn't them that had the office frozen in place. It was the way Samuel's gaze immediately locked onto Clara. For a moment, there was no sound except the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, Samuel spoke. Clara, he said, his deep voice firm yet controlled. Come here. A ripple of confusion spread through the office. Clara, the janitor? Employees exchanged uneasy glances. Eric's confident smirk faltered. Madeline's breath hitched. Clara inhaled deeply. This was it. She stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. The room seemed to shrink as every pair of eyes followed her. Eric's face darkened with confusion. He took a half step forward as if to protest, but stopped himself. Samuel continued watching Clara with an expression unreadable to everyone except her. As she reached his side, he turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the gathered employees. Then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill through the room. You've all met my daughter, I assume, he said smoothly. A collective gasp rippled through the office. Eric's entire body stiffened. Madeline stumbled back a step, her face turning ashen. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Someone in the back whispered, Daughter? But she's been... Samuel held up a hand, and the whisper died instantly. This company, he continued, his voice steady, was built on the foundation of respect, integrity, and fairness. At least, that's what I thought. But recent events have shown me otherwise. Clara turned slightly, her gaze landing directly on Madeline. The woman looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. Samuel's eyes flicked toward Eric Simmons, who had gone completely pale. I expected better from the people entrusted with leadership in my company, Samuel went on, his tone growing sharper. I expected professionalism. What I did not expect was outright discrimination and humiliation within these walls. Eric tried to regain his composure, forcing a stiff smile. Sir, this is just a misunderstanding. Samuel cut him off with a single look. Is it? His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Because from what I hear, you've spent the last several days making a sport out of degrading the very person who now holds your future in her hands. Madeline made a strangled sound, her hands trembling. Sir, I didn't know. Samuel exhaled slowly, then turned to Clara. What do you think should be done? The room was so quiet that the distant ringing of a phone down the hall seemed deafening. Clara's eyes never left Madeline. Then she shifted her gaze to Eric, her expression unreadable. The power was hers now, and she wasn't about to waste it. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice cool but strong. Fire them. Eric Simmons stood confidently near the center of the room, adjusting his tie, preparing himself for what he believed would be his moment of glory. His years of dedication, his ability to uphold the company's standards, and his ruthless efficiency in maintaining Johnson Technologies' reputation, he was certain Samuel Johnson would notice all of it today. Beside him, Madeline Brooks smoothed her blouse, anticipation evident in her eyes. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. The CEO himself had arrived, and with any luck, this would be the opportunity for promotions, recognition, power. Neither of them spared a single thought for Clara Johnson, the janitor they had spent the past few days tormenting. To them, she was just another background character in their corporate world. But what they didn't realize was that they were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Then it happened. The elevator doors dinged, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned as Samuel Johnson stepped out. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, his tailored gray suit a testament to his wealth and influence. His presence alone commanded respect. Behind him, his personal assistants, security, and senior executives walked with calculated precision. As he moved forward, every single employee stood a little straighter. Eric puffed out his chest, standing tall, already mentally preparing his opening pitch. Madeline folded her hands neatly in front of her, already envisioning herself getting in the CEO's good graces. Employees whispered excitedly. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Samuel reached the center of the office floor and turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the gathered employees. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was calculated, almost like he was waiting for something. And then he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel began, his voice smooth yet powerful, "today is a very special day for this company." People held their breath. Eric leaned forward slightly, eager. Madeline's hands clasped together, her eyes shining with excitement. Samuel continued, "For years I have built Johnson Technologies with the hope of leaving behind a legacy, a company that stands for greatness, success, and most importantly," he paused, glancing around the room, "integrity." A few people shifted awkwardly at that word. Then Samuel smiled again. "And today I am proud to announce that my firstborn child is officially here in the building." Silence. A wave of confusion swept through the room. Firstborn child? People glanced at each other. His child? The new CEO? Eric's heart started racing. He had never seen Samuel's eldest child before. No one had. There had been rumors, whispers of an heir, but nothing ever confirmed. The murmurs started. "Wait, has anyone met his child before? I thought he had a younger son from his second wife. Who is it?" Eric's mind was racing. If Samuel's child was the new CEO, that meant they were already in the office. But where, madame? His eyes darted around the room, scanning for a familiar, well-dressed executive. Then, in his mind, it clicked. Of course. The only logical explanation was that it had to be one of the young, wealthy white men in tailored suits, standing quietly in the back. Maybe one of the finance department executives? Eric smirked. This was perfect. A privileged white CEO, exactly how things should be. Madeline, standing beside him, gave him a small nod of agreement. They had nothing to worry about. But then Samuel spoke again, and this time his words shook the entire room. "My child is already here," Samuel said, his voice steady and proud. "Clara, come here." Time stopped. Every single pair of eyes turned, searching. Eric's confident smirk froze. Madeline's breath caught in her throat, because there, still in her janitor's uniform, still holding her mop, still standing right where they had left her, was Clara Johnson. Silence. Complete. Utter silence. And then Eric's face drained of color. Madeline let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Employees whispered in shock, their gazes darting between Clara and Samuel. The woman they had ignored, the woman they had mocked, the woman they had treated like trash. She was their new CEO. It was at that moment that Eric knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Right here, in this office, in front of every single employee. Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks were about to face the consequences of their actions. They had spent days mocking Clara Johnson, laughing at her, treating her as if she were beneath them. Never, in their wildest dreams, did they think that the woman they had humiliated was the one who now held their future in her hands. But now that truth was standing right in front of them. For a moment, for just a brief second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air in the office was so thick with tension you could almost hear hearts racing. Eric, standing near the center of the room, stared blankly at Clara, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Madeline, standing just a few feet away, felt her stomach drop. Her face went pale. Her eyes widened with disbelief, because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Clara, the janitor? No, that wasn't possible. They had spent the last few days belittling this woman. They had made her clean their messes, spilled drinks just so she would have to mop them up. Madeline had even thrown coffee across the table and made her clean it right in front of everyone. And now they were being told that this same woman was the CEO of Johnson Technologies? No, it had to be a joke, a sick, twisted joke. But it wasn't. Clara stepped forward, her posture perfect, her face calm, but her eyes, her eyes were sharp, focused, because today she was done playing games. She looked around the room, watching. Employees whispered, "Wait, is this real? That's the new CEO, but she's been a janitor this whole time." Clara's gaze swept over each and every one of them, as if silently memorizing their faces. And then finally she spoke. "I assume you all have a lot of questions." Her voice was smooth, steady, and filled with authority. The room was dead silent. Eric, still frozen in place, blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling for something, anything to say. Madeline looked like she wanted to disappear. Clara let the silence hang in the air for a few seconds. Then she turned to her father, Samuel Johnson, who stood beside her, hands behind his back, watching with quiet approval. Clara nodded slightly. Her father nodded back. And just like that, the room belonged to her. A hushed murmur rippled through the office as Clara Johnson stood at the center of it all, her presence no longer unnoticed. The janitor they had mocked, the woman they had humiliated, was now the person holding their futures in her hands. She let the silence linger. Let them feel the weight of the moment. "I have worked in this building as a janitor," Clara said, her voice steady, controlled. A fresh wave of shock and disbelief spread through the room. Murmurs, whispers, nervous glances. "I wanted to see how this company, my company, treats people when they think no one is watching." Her eyes locked onto Eric Simmons. He gulped, his face turning a shade paler. "And what I saw," Clara continued, her voice dropping slightly, "was not only disappointing, but disgusting." Eric flinched, his breathing quickened. Clara took a step toward him. "You assumed I was a nobody. You mocked me, laughed in my face, and you did it with complete confidence, because you thought you were untouchable." Eric's hands started shaking. He tried to speak, to salvage whatever dignity he had left. But before he could, Clara raised a hand. His mouth snapped shut. Then she turned her head and looked at Madeline Brooks. Madeline's face was bright red, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, for a lifeline. She found nothing. Clara tilted her head. "And you," she said softly. Madeline sucked in a sharp breath. "You threw coffee across a table and made me clean it." Madeline squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clenching at her sides. Clara let the weight of her words settle in. Then she spoke one last time. "Tell me something." The room held its breath. "If you had known who I was from the start, would you have treated me differently?" Silence. A long, painful silence. And then Madeline nodded, slowly, shamefully. Clara smiled because now the power was in her hands. For a moment, for just a brief, agonizing second, Eric hoped this was all a dream, a nightmare, because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He had spent days belittling Clara Johnson, treating her as if she were nothing. And now she stood before him in the same uniform they had mocked her for wearing, but with the power to end his entire career. Clara turned slowly, scanning the room. She memorized every face. Some had stood by and watched. Some had laughed along with the abuse. But one or two had shown kindness. And Clara had been watching everything. Then her gaze locked onto Eric. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clara spoke. "Eric Simmons." The words cut through the silence like a blade. Eric flinched, his hands clenched at his sides, his entire body stiffened, because he knew. He knew what was coming. But still, he had to try. Sir, Eric stammered, forcing a shaky smile onto his face. I had no idea. Clara raised a single hand. Eric's mouth snapped shut. Because the thing about power, you know when you've lost it, and Eric Simmons had just lost everything. Clara took a step forward. Let me ask you something, Eric. Her voice was smooth, calm, deadly. Eric swallowed hard. Clara tilted her head slightly. If you had known who I was, she continued, would you have treated me the way you did? Eric froze. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had no answer, because they both knew the truth. Eric lowered his head. His voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know. Clara smirked. I know, she said simply. That was the entire point. Because Eric hadn't been cruel because he was having a bad day. He hadn't been disrespectful because he was stressed. No, Eric had belittled Clara because he thought she was beneath him. And that was something Clara would never forget or forgive. Then Clara's eyes moved to Madeline. She had been standing frozen, gripping the edge of her dress like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. And now those terrified eyes were locked onto Clara's. Madeline tried to smile. Sir, I was just following company policy, she blurted out. Clara raised an eyebrow. Company policy? Madeline nodded quickly, desperate. Yes, sir. I was just... Clara cut her off. Throwing coffee across a table? Madeline's face turned ghostly pale. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because there was no excuse. Clara let the moment sit, let the weight of their actions crush them. Then she turned to her father. Samuel Johnson had been watching this entire thing unfold. His expression was unreadable, and for the first time in his career, Samuel Johnson was ashamed. Ashamed of what his company had become, ashamed of the employees he had trusted, ashamed that his own daughter had been treated this way. And now he was about to set things right. Samuel stepped forward. He looked at Eric, then at Madeline, then at Clara. Then finally he sighed. Clara, Samuel said slowly, what do you think should be done? Eric visibly trembled. Madeline clutched her hands together, pleading silently. And Clara did not hesitate. Fire them, Samuel nodded. Eric Simmons, he said, his voice calm but final. Your employment in this company is terminated immediately. Eric's knees nearly buckled. No, he choked. No, please, Samuel ignored him. He turned to Madeline. Madeline Brooks, your position as supervisor is revoked. You are no longer employed here. Madeline let out a silent scream. She spun to Clara, her eyes wide, desperate. Sir, please, I didn't mean... Clara held up her hand. Madeline's words died in her throat. And just like that, it was done. Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks had spent days humiliating Clara Johnson. Now they were the ones with nothing left. But Clara wasn't finished. She turned to the employees. And then she smiled. Not all of you stayed silent. And at that moment, one employee stepped forward. It was Natalie Parker, the one person who had defended Clara when no one else did. And now she was about to be rewarded. Clara turned to her father. My first decision as CEO, she said, is to promote Natalie, effective immediately. Gasps, shock, and just like that, balance had been restored. For days, Clara Johnson had watched. She had watched how they treated her. She had watched how they laughed. She had watched as they stripped away her dignity, believing she had none to begin with. And now the truth had been revealed. Eric Simmons, gone. Madeline Brooks, disgraced. And the rest of the employees? They were about to hear the most important words of their lives. Because this wasn't just about one woman's victory. This was about changing a system that had allowed discrimination, cruelty, and arrogance to thrive unchecked. The silence in the room was deafening. The same employees who had once laughed at Clara, the same ones who had whispered behind her back, the same ones who had treated her as if she were invisible. Now they couldn't even look her in the eye. She still stood there in her janitor's uniform, still holding the same quiet, powerful presence. But now there was no one left to doubt who she was, because today she was their leader. Clara took a step forward, then another. The weight of the moment settled over the room, heavy and inescapable. She slowly scanned every single face, letting them feel the gravity of what had just transpired. Then finally she spoke. Respect. One word, but it cut through the air like thunder. She let it sit there. Let them feel it. Then she continued. Respect is not something that should be reserved for a select few. Her voice was steady, unwavering. It is not something that should be dictated by race, by class, by the way a person dresses or the way they speak. She let the words sink in, watched as heads lowered in shame. Respect should be the foundation of everything we do. She turned her gaze toward the conference room table, the same one Madeline had thrown coffee across. I have walked these halls. She let her fingers trail across the polished surface. I have been invisible to you. Her voice dropped slightly, the weight of it pressing down on them like bricks. I have been ignored, belittled, insulted. She turned, her piercing gaze sweeping over the room. I have been forced to clean up messes, created for the sole purpose of humiliating me. A heavy silence followed. The guilt was sinking in. She saw it. She felt it. But still, she wasn't done. Through all of it, she had learned one thing. She paused. Every breath in the room was held. Then she spoke. The people who tear others down do it because they are afraid. Murmurs, a shift in the air. She nodded. Afraid of change, afraid of equality, afraid of a world where power is not determined by privilege, but by integrity. The air crackled with electricity, because she was right, and everyone in that room knew it. She let the words linger for a moment longer. Then finally, she ended it. That ends today. You could hear a pin drop, because these weren't just words. This was a promise. Clara turned to her father, the man who had built this company from the ground up, the man who had trusted others to run it, the man who had just learned that some of those people had been running it into the ground. Samuel Johnson nodded once. He wasn't just looking at his daughter. He was looking at the future. Clara took a deep breath. Then she made her first executive decision. Effective immediately, she announced, this company will be implementing new policies to ensure that discrimination has no place in our offices. A few employees gasped, but none of them spoke against it, because really, what could they say? Clara continued, there will be accountability. There will be consequences. There will be change. Then she did something no one expected. She smiled, because this moment, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making people suffer. It was about building something better. She stepped forward, scanning the faces of every single employee. This company, she declared, will no longer be built on arrogance. She let that settle. It will be built on respect. A pause. On fairness, she looked around, on the belief that we all rise when we lift each other up. And just like that, the entire company shifted, because at that moment, they didn't just see Clara Johnson as their CEO, they saw her as their leader. And for the first time, they knew this company was finally in the right hands. Clara turned back to her father. Samuel Johnson took a deep breath. His chest rose with pride. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped forward and shook his daughter's hand. A declaration, a public acknowledgement, an unspoken truth. This company, Johnson Technologies, belonged to Clara Johnson. And with that, a new era began. The story of Clara Johnson is more than just a tale of revenge or corporate justice. It is a lesson in perseverance, integrity, and the power of true leadership. At its core, it reveals a truth that exists not just in one office, but across countless workplaces and institutions. People are often judged by appearances, not by their abilities or worth. Clara, despite being the rightful heir to Johnson Technologies, was treated as less than human simply because she appeared to hold no power. This is the reality that so many people face, being overlooked, underestimated, and disrespected based on race, class, or position. But Clara's story teaches us that true power does not lie in a title, but in character and integrity. One of the most profound lessons from this story is the importance of respect, not just for those in authority, but for everyone. Respect should not be conditional on someone's wealth, appearance, or social status. Eric Simmons and Madeline Brooks operated under the belief that power gave them the right to mistreat others. But real power comes from treating people with dignity, regardless of their position. They learned the hard way that the way you treat people when you think no one is watching defines who you are. For those who stood by and allowed mistreatment to happen, the lesson was equally clear. Silence in the face of wrongdoing makes you complicit. Another critical takeaway is the importance of accountability in systemic change. Clara did not just punish those who wronged her. She took steps to ensure that the toxic culture that allowed such behavior to thrive would be eradicated. By implementing new policies and holding people accountable, she did not just fix a personal grievance. She changed the company for the better. This highlights an essential truth. Real change is not about seeking revenge, but about creating a system where fairness and integrity are the foundation. Finally, Clara's journey is a testament to the power of patience and long-term vision. She could have revealed her identity the moment she was mistreated. She could have used her power immediately to expose Eric and Madeline, but instead she waited. She observed, learned, and gathered evidence, not for vengeance, but to make lasting and meaningful change. This is a lesson in emotional intelligence and leadership, knowing when to act, when to wait, and how to make an impact that extends beyond personal justice. In the end, Clara's story teaches us that true leadership is not about controlling people. It is about inspiring change. She rose above hatred and discrimination, proving that integrity, fairness, and respect will always be more powerful than fear and arrogance. For anyone who has ever been mistreated and or underestimated, this story serves as a reminder. Your value is not determined by how others see you, but by how you see yourself and the impact you choose to make on the world. If you found Clara Johnson's story inspiring and believe that everyone deserves respect, no matter their position, race, or background, then show your support. Drop a comment below. Have you ever faced unfair treatment at work or in life? How did you handle it? Share your experience. We want to hear your story. Hit that like button if you believe that workplaces should be built on fairness, integrity, and accountability. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned for more powerful stories that expose injustice, celebrate resilience, and remind us all that true power comes from integrity, not privilege. Let's build a community that stands for fairness and respect. Subscribe now and be part of the change.